Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. Silently stalking to track down and destroy an enemy they never see. The toughest job in the Navy belongs to sub-hunters, armed to attack from every angle. From the first depth charges in World War I to the impact of guided torpedoes on German U-boats, from rockets to robots, trace the explosive menace of sub-hunters. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Initially, the only way sailors could detect an enemy submarine was to see it. By World War I, the best way, and most often the only way, to sink a sub was to explode a large can of TNT next to it. However, as submarines became a more formidable threat to the safety of sailors, ships, and supplies, military planners quickly scrambled to develop the special weapons and coordinated tactics of anti-submarine warfare. The tables were turned. The hunter now became the hunted. From its earliest days, the U.S. Navy has been armed for one purpose: to maintain freedom of the seas. For many people, this projection of power is symbolized by surface ships and supersonic aircraft. These systems are often in the limelight, capturing headlines in the public's imagination. Alongside them, though, is a team of quiet professionals with a job that may be less glamorous, but is growing more important every day. Their wartime mission is deadly serious: to hunt down, identify, and destroy a most elusive adversary, an enemy submarine. It has been said that of all the types of naval warfare, the anti-submarine battle most occupies the thinking of senior strategists, for no other weapon is as surprising and deadly as the submersible ship. Although the submarines are out of sight, they aren't completely out of reach. Carrier-based Vikings patrol thousands of miles per flight, searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. Ship-based Seahawks join them, listening for the telltale sounds of an intruder below. Long-range P-3 hunter killers are on a watch for hours at a time, while deep-diving attack submarines track their counterparts all over the world. In the Cold War years, anti-submarine warfare was no less difficult, but at least the enemy was clearly defined. Until recently, the Soviet Union was the threat. At one time, in the 1980s, the Russian Navy was accepting a new submarine every 4 weeks. Today, the old guard is gone, but the large number of submarines they built are still there.
Although the Russian Navy is now busily disposing of its old submarines, it's also trying to sell off a lot of its less old and newer boats to emerging nations. There is now the risk of third world nations, of another Saddam Hussein getting hold of a submarine and threatening merchant shipping in one part of the world or another.
With countries such as Cuba, Libya, North Korea building submarine forces, the threat they pose may be greater than an all-out war among superpowers.
When you consider the number of weapons in the third world, the fact that 42 other countries have submarines today, more countries, Iran, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, more countries are getting submarines. The underwater world is becoming more dangerous. And I question if the United States will have the resources to effectively confront countries in the underwater environment, let alone fight them.
The submarine wasn't always considered such a threat. At the turn of the century, the first underwater boats were almost toy-like compared to the ironclad dreadnoughts of the day. As an experimental boat, they were interesting, but few admirals considered them as serious weapons of war. The first U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Holland, carried torpedoes and a small cannon, but they were immobile, welded inside her bow. The Holland had to be turned precisely in the direction of its target to fire, and without a periscope, it rarely scored a hit in practice. Improved submarines followed, with longer hulls, diesel engines, and greater ranges. They began to show promise, but it took a world war to make most people take notice of them. As the Great War spread across Europe and into the Atlantic in 1914, the British and German navies defied convention and held back their large warships, preferring to blockade each other's harbors instead. By 1915, with large numbers of British mines off the coast, the German High Command turned to its small U-boat force to prosecute the war. With a mixture of bravery and ruthlessness, these submariners set out on the Atlantic in search of vessels bound for England.
When they spotted the smoke from a merchant ship, the submarine would race at high speed until they could identify what kind of a target it was. When they got within sight of the target, they would figure out which direction the target was going, try to race ahead of the target on the surface to get an angle that, as the ship approached, they could fire their torpedoes at it.
Once in position, the U-boat would slip beneath the surface and sneak up on its target.
Using its periscope, it would then line up the torpedo shot, fire, depending upon the size of the target, the importance, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 torpedoes.
In the first 4 months of 1917, 2 million tons of cargo were lost. The submarine had arrived as a viable weapon of war. When the Americans resolved to enter the war in 1917, their expeditionary force was the largest army ever to leave U.S. shores and the first to fight in Europe. To pass through the submarine-infested waters, the Navy grouped large passenger ships and cargo vessels together with warships to sail in convoys. The first means of defense for these ships was suggested by the British, who discovered dazzle painting. By brushing red and black abstract designs on the vessel's sides, its profile was found to be less pronounced on the high seas and appeared to blend into the horizon. This patchwork of cubism also made it more difficult to determine the ship's speed and direction, and less than 1% of all dazzle-painted ships were lost at sea. Other anti-submarine measures, however, weren't quite as effective.
The standard anti-submarine system was to find a submarine submerged using its periscope, to row across to it, put a black bag over the periscope, and smash out the glass of the periscope with a hammer. That remained a standard operational technique until 1917.
As flying boats came off the assembly line, they were seen as an attractive scouting vehicle to protect convoys near the coast.
And it wasn't really until 1917 that aircraft became a potent anti-submarine weapon. Not only were they fast and able to catch submarines on the surface, but because of their height, they were able to look down into the water and see shallow dive submarines and attack them with gunfire.
The airship was also coming into its own as a reliable scouting vehicle. It could stay aloft longer, carry more personnel, and it made an ideal bombing platform. During the war, the Royal Navy used more than 200 lighter-than-air blimps off the English coast to seek out and occasionally attack German submarines. But the best weapon to guard against the U-boats and ensure the safety of the convoys was the destroyer escort. The old four-pipers were rugged and dependable, even in the worst weather.
It was found that the destroyer, because of its high speed and relatively long endurance, was an ideal craft to counter the submarine. If it caught it on the surface, it had sufficient gunfire and torpedo power to sink it.
4-inch guns awaited the U-boats on the surface. The difficulty was finding them underwater.
Initially, the only way you could detect a submarine was to see it. But once they were underwater, you could hear the noise as the submarine went through the water, the flow noises, as they now call them. So passive hydrophones, just listening devices, were hung over the sides of ships to listen for submarines.
The hydrophones were simply underwater microphones. If their operators heard a U-boat close by, they would release smoke screens to buy more time. Then, after positioning themselves above the submarine, the destroyer men unleashed their most effective, the depth charge. First introduced in 1916 by the British, the depth charges were packed with about 300 pounds of explosive TNT.
The depth charge looked like a trash can, and you would just roll it off the back of a ship as you passed over the submarine. And hopefully the explosion would destroy the submarine. Very soon they fitted hydrostatic fuses to these, which were devices that would explode the depth charge at a preset depth. When the depth charge explodes underwater near a submarine, not only is it the force of explosive that might damage the submarine, but the water itself that goes out from the explosion of the depth charge has tremendous force. And it's hoped that the explosive force will buckle plates on the submarine or break things that will cause a casualty that will force the submarine to the surface.
Once on top, the Germans were outgunned and outmanned. By the war's end, 178 of the Untersee boats were on the bottom. The convoy system of destroyer escorts proved to be a resounding success. Of the 16,000 ships that sailed in convoys, only 96 were sunk. A new type of warfare, anti-submarine warfare, was born. The destroyers that fought in the First World War found their toughest adversary at home. Peace through disarmament was the spirit which moved the Washington Arms Conference of 1922. As a result, over 200 U.S. destroyers were eventually mothballed, and the construction of new destroyers came to a standstill for nearly 12 years. The submarine, however, continued to evolve. Advances in torpedo designs, faster engines, and powerful deck guns made them more lethal than ever. The airplane was seen by many to have the most potential in an anti-submarine role. One of the first craft built specifically to track subs was the NC-4 flying boat. It captured the world's headlines in 1919 by flying from Rockaway, New York to Lisbon, Portugal. The NC-4 demonstrated aircraft could patrol an area the width of the Atlantic. Airplanes also made effective smokescreen dispensers, blocking the surface fleet out of a submarine's periscope. The Martin torpedo bomber could deliver torpedoes against surface ships, but to drop them on submarines, sufficient underwater guidance systems would have to be developed. Airships were also the subject of experimentation. When the USS Los Angeles took on an airplane in 1929, many predicted it would be the ultimate anti-submarine system. But airships required special handling and proved cumbersome when they were deployed with surface ships. Their inability to operate in foul weather convinced the Navy to look elsewhere. After the Japanese victory at Pearl Harbor and their successive conquests in the Philippines and neighboring islands, the U.S. Navy turned to its versatile Catalina PBY flying boat to combat Japanese submarines. The Catalinas were ideally suited for sub-hunting. Without the need for runways, they could be forward-based on remote islands in the South Pacific. Speed wasn't its best asset. With a crew of 10 and a full bomb load, it could fly barely more than 100 miles an hour.
It was like a truck. I mean, it was an airplane that you had to hoist around. You had to muscle it a little bit, but it could sure do an awful lot of things.
The crews aboard the Catalinas were among the first to use sonobuoys. These were floating buoys with a hydrophone on one end and a radio transmitter on the other. After dropping a number of sonobuoys in a grid-like pattern across the water, the crew in the air listened to their radio for the noise of Japanese submarines. Since sound travels up to 20 times farther in water than in the air, the hydrophone operators could accurately measure the sub's course and speed as it passed from one buoy to the next. If destroyers were in the area, the course was marked with flares, and the ships were guided in for the attack. The Catalinas also employed one of the first prototype magnetic anomaly detectors.
Now, this is simply a magnetometer attached to the tail end of an airplane. This magnetometer would detect anything metallic that had passed directly over. The idea was to fly these airplanes over the water. If you passed over a submerged submarine, it would give you an indication. And with this indication, then, we were able to track that submarine underneath the water and get effects on his movement, and then fly down that line of movement and attack the submarine even though you couldn't see it.
PBY Catalinas were also used in the Caribbean and Atlantic against a new generation of German submarines. Between 1939 and 1943, the Untersee boats wreaked havoc once again against convoys headed toward England. Even the mighty British battleship Barham was no match for 3 well-placed U-boat torpedoes. The German submariners had a new tactic they called the Wolf Pack. This time they operated in groups of 6 to 10 and concentrated their operations in the middle of the Atlantic, where it was difficult for shore-based aircraft to patrol for long periods.
They had an immediate and devastating effect on merchant shipping. During the Battle of the Atlantic, they were able to sink vast numbers of British and Allied merchant ships that were sailing alone, or that were stragglers from convoys. And this led to the development of air cover.
With most of the U.S. carriers tied up in the Pacific, a number of merchant vessels were fitted with flat tops to become small airplane launching pads. Designated escort carriers, they lacked the speed and size of conventional carriers. Although their decks had room for as few as 20 aircraft, their presence was felt immediately. carriers also brought with them a new type of torpedo.
Until World War II, torpedoes were what are called straight runners. You fired them, launched them from an aircraft, they went in a straight line to the target. During World War II, the U.S. started using acoustic homing torpedoes. Torpedoes that when they entered the water, began searching for the sounds generated by a submarine. The kill ratio of launching these weapons and a torpedo striking a submarine was very high, almost 100% when they were introduced.
Oil on the surface meant the U-boat had hit the bottom. Airborne radar systems were placed aboard long-range B-24 Liberators, allowing them to sneak up on surfaced subs.
These aircraft would take off with a crew of about 20 people and fly into the middle of the Atlantic, find the convoy they were allocated to protect, and they were equipped with depth charges and bombs, and a pack of 4 cannon under the fuselage with which to attack these submarines. At night, from about the middle of 1942, the B-24s used powerful searchlights called lee lights, so they could sneak up on a U-boat, catch it on the surface, and attempt to sink it.
Air power was gaining the edge against the submarines. Destroyers were also being modified with an array of top-secret sensors and weapons.
No próximo programa, o desenvolvimento do sonar.